As far as upper-class abodes went, the home of Tobias's family was on the humble side when compared to some of the lavish mansions Tuki had seen in her travels. Shaped like a particularly embellished brick, the walls of the two-story structure were lined with tall windows. No lights shone from within as all the fires had been put out, and the drapes were drawn anyway. Not that Tuki could make out any details from here anyway, as a brickwork wall surrounded the entire property. If that wasn't enough, the faintly audible sounds of armored feet shuffling through trimmed grass or over polished cobbles told her the domain had guards on patrol.
On any other occasion, I might respect solid security. Tonight, though, it's just annoying,
she whispered to herself, pressed close to the wall to hide from any sentries who might have been on the roof. She hadn't seen any, but she wasn't willing to discount the possibility. She had done her best to examine the home from a distance, looking for weaknesses or gaps in the defenses. Thankfully, there was a break in the wall along the northern side. Less thankfully, she'd still have to climb up and over, and the stones there looked loose and prone to collapse. The last thing she needed was to make a misstep and draw the entire nightstaff down on her head. So instead, she pulled out one of the tools in her kit, a grappling hook and a length of 50 feet of rope. Wanting to ensure silence, she took a spare roll of cloth out of her pack and tied strips around the metal prongs to muffle any impacts. It was easier said than done with her wrist as it was, but she could manage. Then she waited, listening carefully to the passage of feet. She waited for the patrol to pass her several times, spending almost 15 minutes in one place just to make sure she had the timing of their passage memorized. When at last she was confident she had a window of opportunity, Tuki gave her grappling hook a few swings, then threw it up at the top of the wall. She flinched at the slight scrape made by the base of the hook, but no one else seemed to hear it. Tugging to ensure it was secure, she began her ascent, as quickly and as quietly as she could. The climb was hard on her thighs and shoulders, but the real trouble was in her wrist. She wasn't exactly heavy. Between malnourishment and hollow bones, she was fairly light. But even so, trying to lift her weight without being able to make full use of one of her arms made the ascent a slow and cumbersome affair. And that wasn't the last problem. Once she reached the top of the wall and put her hook and rope away in her pack, there was the lengthy drop to the other side. It was nothing to clack her beak at, and she was fragile enough as it was. And she didn't have time to waste climbing down. Another patrol could cross her path, and failing that, someone up on the roof might look down and spot her. Internally resigning herself to the fact that this was going to hurt, she lowered herself and dropped as soon as her arms were pulled taut. She bent her knees to soften the impact, and only made a moderate thump, as opposed to a cacophonous one.
For once, my hollow bones work in my favor,
she thought. Her calves and shins burned in protest from the drop, and her wrist was similarly burning in protest. She wouldn't be using it anymore tonight, she had a feeling. She didn't allow herself to rest, though. She cast her eyes about quickly to ensure she was in the clear. The inside of the fenced-in area was largely as she had expected. A path of cobbled stones encircled the house, framed on either side by neatly maintained grass, shrubbery, and garden flowers. A walk around the mansion would not lack color. Tuki had the good fortune of landing between two such bushes. She tucked herself behind one of them and waited for the next patrol to pass. The pattern held as she had expected it to, and as soon as the guard had wandered past her, she broke silently from her cover and approached the nearest window. She held an eye up to the narrow gap in the drapes, but in the darkness she couldn't see much besides vague shapes. She swore silently and crept along behind the guard, maintaining a constant distance from him while peeking into each window she passed. Each was the same, and she found she had no confidence to brave any room unless she knew what awaited her. As the guard rounded to the front of the building, Tuki had to stop. 2 guards were stationed in front of the mansion's entrance. They were bored and sleepy, but Tuki still didn't want to try sneaking by under their noses. The lit lanterns on their belts would make any such effort a waste of time, and probably a waste of her life. So she doubled back, sacrificing her stable and safe position in exchange for navigational freedom. Approaching the back of the mansion, she caught sight of something she had not been expecting. A well-maintained patio sprawled out before her, a pair of neat double doors leading into the house. Chairs covered in cloth, presumably nailed to their spot on the ground, were scattered around in clumps of 2s and 3s. But that wasn't what had Tuki's attention. No, it was the square-shaped pit in the center of the patio. It looked decidedly newer than the stone around it, not at all matching the carefully crafted patterns of the floor. It was also full of steaming water, and it was glowing. Curious, Tuki ensured there was no one else in the yard, then darted to the side of the steaming pit. Peeking into the water, her eyes widened.
Magic?
She thought, as she beheld the unmistakable glow of a ringstone embedded in the bottom of the pit, and arcane runes all along the floor in a neat circle. An eternally warm outdoor bathtub, large enough to comfortably house 6 people and twice that many if they favored intimacy. There was even a step of additional stones that provided seating. Tuki did not have long to contemplate the strange addition to the property, however. Light fell over her, muted but sharply contrasting with the darkness of the night. Her heart jumped into her throat and she looked back. Firelight was shining through the drapes of the windows surrounding the back door. Someone was coming. Cursing, Tuki rose and sprinted for the nearest cover she could find, a line of flowering shrubs. She threw herself behind them. She had to bite her tongue to keep from hollering as her wrist caught some of the fall, sending lances of fire rolling up and down her arm. She quickly rolled onto her side and curled into a ball to make herself as small as possible. And just in time, too. The doors opened, and 2 pairs of footsteps entered the patio. A voice spoke, one Tuki didn't recognize, that of a woman.
Did you hear something?
Another voice answered her, Tobias. Must have been one of the guards. You saw them maintaining the grounds, yes? The woman hummed.
I suppose.
Come now, there's no need for idle distractions, Tobias said in a jovial tone that harshly contrasted with the snarling, sputtering brat Tuki had encountered in Diana's bakery. Come, Shayla, come this way. I've something to show you. The woman, Shayla, let off a weary sigh, and Tuki had the impression she did not care for Tobias, but followed along with him regardless. More footsteps, and Tuki estimated they came to a stop by the ever-warm bath.
What is this?
I had some work done, Tobias explained. We had an enchanter in town a few weeks back, didn't you know? I had him add this to the patio. Look, it never gets cold. A perfect way to warm oneself when the winter snows roll in, Shayla hummed softly.
I imagine such an arrangement was costly.
Very, Tobias agreed witlessly, but very worth it. If it pleases you, my lady, I'd be glad to show you how it works. Shayla sighed again. Tuki heard a soft thump and a grunt.
Tobias, are you asking me to strip naked? In your backyard?
What? Afraid someone will see you? I suppose that is a fair point. Perhaps inside, then? No prying eyes to behold you there, Tobias suggested, and Tuki felt the urge to vomit.
That would be extremely inappropriate, sir,
Shayla said back in a tense voice.
It is late already and I must be getting home. Your new tub is intriguing, but my cat will get lonely.
So will I. But I suppose I see your point. Tobias relented. Still, if I may present you with something before you depart. Tuki blinked. Was this man seriously this inept and oblivious? Why was Shayla even here? She clearly wasn't interested in the man's advances.
Although Tobias is in a position of power,
Tuki considered a moment later, and her features darkened.
So she's either playing along for the benefits involved, or she's afraid to refuse him outright for fear of the consequences.
Her disdain for Tobias shifted from simple frustration at his ineptitude to abject disgust. Tuki heard the rustling of cloth. Here you are, Tobias said a moment later. I am told this comes from the jungles of Orovia, far to the south. A fine piece of beautiful jewelry to accompany such a pretty face. Do take it, I insist.
You are too kind,
Shayla said haltingly, accepting whatever gift it was Tobias had handed her.
It is beautiful, I will agree.
I thought you might, Tobias said. Now, may I at least treat you to a glass of wine before you depart?
No, thank you. I find I have no stomach for alcohol.
A pity. Come then, I'll see you out. Tuki held her breath, staying perfectly still as the two walked back inside. Curiously, she heard no click from the door. Shortly after, another patrol passed, and then she was alone. Releasing a gasp, Tuki rose from her hiding place and glared at Tobias's mansion.
What a pig,
she grumbled, making a rude gesture at the home before dusting herself off. Moving quickly, she approached the back door. The lights were still on inside, but she heard no voices. Carefully, she tried the handle. It hadn't latched. Not wanting to look a gift horse in the mouth, Tuki slipped a single small needle from her pack into the locking mechanism, then retreated to her hiding place. She didn't want to be creeping through the mansion while Tobias was still up and about. She waited until the lights were snuffed, then waited for at least 3 more passes of the patrol. She checked the door to ensure her needle had done its job. And it had. If Tobias had tried to lock the door, it had failed to latch. Satisfied, Tuki let herself inside and silently shut the door behind her. The interior of the mansion was dark and oppressive, but the ring light gave Tuki enough light to see by. She had stepped into a small dining room. 3 doors led out of the room, one to an empty kitchen, one to a washroom, and one to a long corridor that ran the length of the building. Not finding anything of note in the prior rooms, Tuki took a left out of the corridor and began to explore. Thankfully, the bulk of the mansion's security was stationed outside. The halls were quiet and empty, and Tuki saw no signs of a patrol. Still, she elected not to take or light a candle. Someone might notice it was missing, and she had no desire to draw attention to the fact there had been a break-in. And if there were some sparse patrols, she'd rather not give herself away. Eventually, her explorations led her to a small office room on the southern side of the building. Various bookcases lined the walls, filled with tomes on an array of subjects. Monetary manuals, history books, guides on etiquette, atlases, and other necessities for running a community like this. None of these would be of any value to Tuki, however. If this room had anything she wanted, it would likely be in the desk to her left. Closing the door behind her, Tuki padded to the desk. It was polished, dark wood, no doubt not at all native to this region. She idly marveled at how pretty it was, then took a few moments to ensure all was as it seemed. Testing each drawer handle with her pliers, she found no signs of anything harmful, and the lock on the swinging door would be easy enough to pick. She elected to leave that be for now, though. Someone might notice. Moving quickly, she rifled through the drawers, casting her eyes over each sheet in turn. Most of it was uninteresting, just the usual assortment of paperwork associated with the running of a town. Correspondence with neighbors, letters from concerned civilians, an abbreviated list of local laws and policies, and other such mundanities. But when Tuki reached the third drawer, that was when she found the good stuff.
Monetary records,
she quietly squealed to herself, pulling out a sheet of parchment. Given what she was here to do, this was practically a goldmine of information. Quickly, she began to skim the contents, taking in the details as quickly as she could. The first few sheets were of no note. Shipment manifests from trade partners, maintenance costs, normal things. But the further she got, the more oddities she found. First was a receipt for an order made to someone in a neighboring town. On the sheet were detailed and elaborate sketches of a rapier, along with prices for each component. According to the notes in the margins, the blade was to be made of solid gold, or at least be covered in it.
That is a lot of zeros,
Tuki thought as she beheld the price listed at the bottom. Next was a receipt for the tub in the backyard. Different formatting, perhaps, but it was unmistakably proof of purchase. Once again, there were many zeros. Did Tobias even know how to barter? There were books on doing good business 10 feet that way. Did he just not read? If he didn't, it might go some way toward explaining how magnificently careless he was with his people's hard-earned coin. Pressing on, Tuki found a list of smaller expenses. They were not as expensive as the golden rapier or the tub, but they still added up. On the list of items was a rare Oraviri ring. Gifts for Shayla, possibly. There were more expenses, but none quite so notable. A shipment of expensive foods from the larger cities deeper in Valrive. Tuki didn't doubt that the landlord of a town would get to enjoy fancier foods than those they governed, but the expenses still seemed higher than what was reasonable for one young man just meant to keep the peace. He was a pig in more ways than one, it seemed, stuffing his face with so many delicacies. All in all, the man's spending was the definition of irresponsible. Tuki smiled to herself and quickly stuffed the receipts into her pack. Closing the desk up as well as she could, she turned for the door to take her leave. A new sound halted her. Footsteps approaching. The doorknob turned. Tuki ducked low and under the desk, clamping her beak shut as the door swung open, and the flickering light of a held candle filled the room. A tired sigh could be heard, and dragging footsteps closed the distance between them. Tuki held perfectly still, clamping a hand around her beak to keep herself quiet. "Damn it," the man grumbled, and again it was Tobias. Tuki's blood drained from her face, her heart hammering a powerful rhythm against her ribs. She thought he was asleep. Had insomnia taken him too? She waited in silent terror for him to take a seat and see the krauven hiding under the desk. He walked around the desk, his legs becoming visible. He was in his pajamas, reaffirming the suspicion that the man had been unable to find sleep. Not that he'd been trying for very long. Thankfully, he did not sit in the chair. Instead, he walked past the desk, lazily scanning the shelves and running his fingers along the various tomes. "Damn coward," he breathed. "Is it so hard to just say it?" It was then that Tuki saw the sheet of parchment in his hand. The writing on it was different, less formal. A letter, perhaps? He held it up to his face and read from it a few times. He sighed wearily. Mayhap I should take lessons in poetry over fencing. I'll not win her over with this drivel. Tobias cast the note aside, and it fell uselessly to the floor. Then he turned and walked along the walls, again scanning the shelves. How did you do it, Father? How did you win Mother's heart? Of course, the moment I need such an answer from you is when you're no longer here to tell me. So hurry back, won't you? For a moment, Tuki almost felt sorry for the man. Almost. If he hadn't been so unashamedly creepy about his advances a minute ago, she might have. Tobias wandered the room in a half-sleeping haze for another few moments, mumbling words incoherently to himself. Eventually, he released a truly magnificent yawn and stepped out, closing the door behind him. Tuki's heart took a long time to calm down. After who knew how long, she crept out of her hiding place.
Gods, it's time to leave,
she thought, holding a hand to her chest. She allowed herself to breathe, and she gasped as the adrenaline fled her. She had what she was here for. There was no point in staying. But curiosity compelled her to pick up the sheet of parchment Tobias had dropped to the floor. She read it. It was a love letter about Shayla. And it was awful. Tuki's neck feathers began to flare up, her cheeks warming. Not because it was in any way arousing or romantic, but out of sheer pity. And also a little bit of disgust. Still, that gift horse was serving her well so far. She took the time to scribble all instances of Shayla's name off the parchment, then stuffed it into her pack with the receipts. That done, her work here was complete. As quietly as she had come, she departed, leaving nothing behind to mark her having ever been there, besides what she took.